Red Playground. Olivia's father was dating again. This wasn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It simply meant that the girl would be alone even more often than usual. But she was used to that. Adults patted her head and called her things like independent and smart all the time. Alone, Olivia would usually play at a game of pretend with her aging collection of stuffed bears. Or she'd read one of the stories on constant rotation upon her bookshelf. Perhaps it was boredom, then, that inspired her to disobey the rules she had never dreamed of breaking before. Or maybe it was the sting of loneliness within her chest when Olivia heard the joyous sound of children at play from inside the walls of her oh-so-quiet house. It was both, she realized, as she slid the screen door shut behind her and followed the sound into the night. Olivia had only ever explored the perimeter of the tree line with her father, which marked the very end of their property. Hence why the girl was so surprised to find what she did upon locating the source of her curiosity. Her sneakers crunched loudly upon dried leaves as she picked her way between this row of gray stones like giant's teeth poking out from the earth. Each had a name etched upon it, save for those that didn't, and Olivia didn't bother to check. As it was hardly light enough to see the ground before her, bright though the watchful moon was. Her eyes were locked in on a flickering between the trees on the far side of the stones. It looked like people running in the distance. Upon reaching the far end of the stones, Olivia found herself standing before a modest playground. As strange a spot though it was, not to mention the odd hour and darkness, kids were playing together as though there was nothing peculiar about it in the slightest. Their laughter filled the brisk evening air as Olivia crossed carefully over the threshold of darkness into the lively circle of bright moonlight. The children paused in their rambunctious play only for a single unanimous moment to gaze upon their new guest. But Olivia blinked. She missed it. So she strolled quietly amidst the jungle gym, past the swing set, and through the other structures, under the assumption that she had gone unnoticed. Beneath this assumption of invisibility, Olivia tread lightly, only observing the children's games for a time until she was suddenly roped into a game of tag. The kids seemed nice enough, the young girl thought to herself, as she tucked herself into bed in the wee hours of the night. They did let her play with them, after all. The following day, Olivia unplugged her nightlight from the wall and wondered how she could have missed all of those kids at school. They must go to the private elementary school, she thought, as she joined her father at the breakfast table. The two of them yawned in unison over their bowls of cereal. Long night? Olivia smiled, lifting her arms up over her head for the big stretch. She hissed before her fingers could lock above her crown of tangled hair. A flash of memory suddenly filled her head. One of the children had tagged her rather aggressively in the ribs the evening before, but she thought nothing of it. As it turned out, she did know her limits as an athlete. Sleep on it the wrong way, kiddo? No, Olivia paused, remembering that her secret adventure was against the rules of the house. Well, yeah, probably. Her father smirked before returning to his meal. After yet another exhausting day of occupying herself with idle games that wouldn't disturb her father at work, Olivia found herself buzzing with eager anticipation as the evening rolled in over her soon-to-be empty house. As soon as she heard her father's car pull out of their driveway, Olivia leaped out from beneath her bedsheets with great urgency in pursuit of her playmates in the woods. She was glad to make their acquaintance again, despite the chill that coursed down the length of her spine when they all froze in their tracks to peer at her upon her arrival. This time, she didn't miss it, although it certainly didn't alarm her enough to keep her from joining their games. As the moonlight beamed down upon the cheerful playground, Olivia watched the faces of her new friends as they shoved one another around. It was an awfully competitive bunch, as was once again confirmed by a new throbbing bump on her head, which she rubbed with her trembling fingers. A mirage of tiny hands pulled Olivia back up onto her feet before she could even think of shedding a tear. Their fingernails left scratches beneath the thin layer of her pajamas as the children tugged her into the next series of games. Olivia winced at the dilating eyes and high-pitched squeals of energy surrounding her. She worried that her friends were growing too excited, hence their rough play, and so she promptly began her solitary walk home. Preoccupied as she was with the growing bump on her head, the young girl didn't notice the peculiar silence of the woods as she stumbled homeward through the rows of stones-like teeth. Not a single cricket sat playing its limbs like a song, nor did any owl dare give away its whereabouts within a wood so thoroughly occupied. It wasn't until the following night that Olivia recognized her giant's teeth for the graves that they were. The weekend with her new friends had taken quite the toll on her small frame already. She also worried that if she revisited them, she might feel too sleepy when it came time for her to wake up for school the next morning. Alas, after another day spent by her lonesome with her father and sole companion busy not being with her, Olivia was an only child. A lonely child at that. And luckily for her, she knew just where to find some company. With laughter like a siren's call from deep within the thicket of trees, the children's presence beckoned Olivia towards them. The sound of excitement being shared always seems to have some power over children, and Olivia was no exception. On her way over to their secret playground, the girl wondered why she had never seen any signs indicating the graveyard's whereabouts. The land was terribly overgrown with moss and weeds, as though the earth was attempting to gobble it all up again. How were people supposed to know it was there? Perhaps nobody wanted to visit these graves, she thought as she neared the moonlit circle. Before she had the opportunity to fully absorb the space ahead of her, Olivia felt the tug of a small hand upon the fabric of her clothes, pulling her fast and hard into the throng of it all. She gasped, unprepared for the strength that emanated from hands the same size as her own. Her knees and elbows banged around quickly upon the hard metal of the jungle gym as the other children pulled her into its cage. The cold of its surface took her breath away as it seeped into her skin and bones, now prickled with goose flesh. Tonight's midnight game consisted of her trying her very best to escape the jungle gym's center, as the other kids worked vigorously to keep her entombed within their grasp. Like a bug in a web, Olivia scrambled futilely in an attempt to evade them, a few of her fingernails broken and bruised from various feet and hands' attempts to block her in. She didn't want to cry in front of them, yet she felt awfully uneasy. They were all so quiet, aside from their bursts of laughter, not to mention how agile a lot of them were as they crawled above and around her like animals, perpetually blocking out the moonlight above her like a swarm. Thoroughly frustrated and running out of breath, Olivia used her last ounce of strength to claw her way through the gaggle of children toward the open air. They seemed surprised to find her lying on the ground beside the metal structure once she fell from the top of it upon escaping. "You won," a soft voice like wind called out from someplace within their midst as Olivia slowly willed her aching body to stand. She didn't bother turning back to look at them as she dragged her tired form home and back into her warm bed, nor did Olivia's thoughts dwell on the children in the woods during the school the next day, aside from when some invisible pain or another would begin to plague her, eliciting the odd wince or groan. It wasn't until later that night, in fact, once the rest of the world was long gone into their dream realms, that Olivia even considered going back to the place beyond the trees. Because as the clock struck 3, Olivia saw them, the kids, standing in a huddled group just beneath her window. "Olivia," the same soft voice called out to her, "come play." Their hands all stretched up towards her, beckoning in the direction of the looming tree line behind them. Half asleep and more sore than ever, the young girl dutifully waved them away. It was a school night after all. The following afternoon, an odd thought dawned on her. She had never told the children what her name was. For 4 more nights, the children returned to her window at the same hour. Olivia rose in the light of day, enshrouded in a fog of drowsiness most unusual for her. "Are you feeling okay?" her father asked over his mug of piping hot coffee. "You should get to bed earlier tonight. Rest up. Don't want you to get stuck in bed over the weekend with a cold or anything, right?" Olivia considered telling her father about the peculiar predicament she found herself in, and the persistence of her friends in the place beyond their yard. But, seeing as he had already burned his tongue in a rush attempt to get breakfast over with, the young girl thought it best to leave her father's mind untroubled. Besides, the weekend was coming around again, and as rough as these funny games were, Olivia was wise enough from all of her 9 years to know that she'd probably need someone to play with come Saturday. Lo and behold, come Saturday evening, Olivia proved herself correct. At the telltale rattle of their garage door opening, and her father's car engine reversing out of the driveway once their nightly bedtime charade was complete, Olivia slipped into the rain boots resting beside the sliding back door and sauntered off into the night. She felt she had grown to know this hour rather well. Her feet moved without any particular effort of the mind as Olivia gazed up at constellations she didn't know the names of. She much preferred to discover and label the shapes of her own invention. Her eyes were gazing upon the sweeping W of Cassiopeia when her skin began to tingle in the presence of her wily companions. Following their usual greeting of pointed eyes, Olivia braced herself for whichever new game they had in mind this time. It had been a while, yet still her fading bruises ached at the not-so-distant memory. Upon finding their many hands guiding her in the direction of the swing set, Olivia allowed herself a hushed sigh of relief and even a small smile. She settled into the cold plastic of the seat and gently kicked off of the ground as the soft creak of the swing's metal chains droned louder with each kick like a moose might, covered by the cloak of night. Olivia giggled at the image in her mind, savoring the serenity of the moment until she felt a series of firm little fingers claw at her feet, her legs, her back. Her laughter caught in the back of her throat and she coughed, nearly choking on it. "No, wait," she whimpered. "What are you—" However, they weren't simply attempting to pull her down off of the swing as Olivia had suspected. Rather, the children's uncannily strong hands pulled her back in the seat as far as they could manage without dumping the bewildered girl out of it altogether, then charged forward with immense might. Olivia shrieked as her legs swung higher than they ever had before. The kids howled too, pushing her further and further with every turn. Olivia's knuckles were white with tension as she locked her grip around the metal chains of the swing. Olivia and the hinges wailed as one being while the stars passed like specks of dirt beneath her rain-boot-clad feet. Her chest felt constricted with pure terror, a sensation not to be confused with anything else. On the 7th push, one of her boots spiraled up, and away into the blur of constellations she could not name. Or maybe down. It was difficult to tell the difference anymore. It was the 9th shove, however, during which Olivia's fingers slipped free of the chains she had so willed herself to cling to. It was the 9th push that sent her body, pulsing with shock, sailing up and then down in a divine arc within pools of moonlight, plunging the girl into a space much darker than anything she had experienced over the course of her previous 9 years. Upon opening her throbbing eyes, Olivia knew 2 things for certain. She couldn't feel anything except tired, and the children she had been playing with were not children at all. What Olivia didn't know was that she was lying in a deep hole within her overground graveyard of Lone Walks Past, 6 feet deep in the ground, to be exact. She also knew that the things she saw standing above her now, peering down at her broken body, were rotten. Their flesh lay hanging and discolored across the length of their little bodies, yellowed bones and muscle exposed beneath the night sky. These were the kids she had been playing with all these nights. Olivia marveled in disgust. "Stay, Olivia," their soft voices beckoned. The soft patter of dirt being cast in handfuls upon Olivia's still breathing body sounded like snow falling delicately upon a secret forest floor, a sound like anything else, an unnoticeable element of nature. Handful after handful commenced until a plot of dirt, much like the rest of the disheveled graveyard, lay silent beneath Olivia's unnamed constellations. "Stay forever," a voice like wind beckoned. Olivia heard the hollow laughter of children echoing throughout the dead playground, including the patient crickets as well as the hidden owls, commenced their songs once again.